Are we live, Enrique? Yes, right? We are, okay. Welcome everyone to the 7th webinar in our series on evidence-based policy in citizen security and justice. This is the last of our webinar. As many of you know, this has been part of the launch of our platform on evidence-based public safety and justice. And we are really thrilled of having the opportunity to have this closing with a very distinguished panel that I'm going to chair. My name is Rodrigo Serrano, and I'm part of the citizen security team at InterAmerican Development Bank. And I was one of the people that led the project of creating this platform. The topic of the webinar, of today's webinar, is on partnerships and agenda for evidence-based policies in security and justice. And we'll have a conversation with three very distinguished academics and practitioners in the area of evidence-based public policy. And let me, before we begin and giving some time to everybody to join, I will give a few messages. So let me share the screen. And okay, can you see? I don't know if I'm projecting or not. Can somebody tell me? Elena, are we seeing the backdrop?
No, no, Rodrigo.
No, okay. So, sorry. Share. No? No?
Now we see it.
Okay. So a few sort of messages. Please silence your mic. Por favor, silenciar el micrófono. As you may have seen, we are going to do this webinar in English, since that's the language that the common denominator among the four of us that will participate in the panel. I thought it was going to be easier to have a conversation if we all spoke the same language. But we have simultaneous interpretation in Spanish and Portuguese. So you'll find there's an icon where you can select in which language you want to listen to it. Please, if you have a question, type it in the chat with your name and where you're from. We have people that will be answering the chat. And let me present then, this is really the fabulous speakers that we have for this session. And I will introduce them briefly. There will be somebody also that is going to be putting on the chat sort of a longer list of accomplishments from this from our panelists. Let me introduce first Amanda Glassman. She is the executive advisor to the president of the InterAmerican Development Bank. Amanda has more than 25 years of experience working and publishing on health, social protection, evidence, and data issues in low and middle income countries, with an emphasis in Latin America and the Caribbean. Prior to her current role, Amanda was executive vice president and senior fellow of the Center for Global Development, a think tank in Washington, D.C., as well as CEO of CGD Europe. And prior to that, Amanda was principal technical lead social protection and health specialist in the IDB social sector, where she led policy dialogue and operations with member countries. And Amanda has published extensively on evidence-based public policy, particularly in middle and low-income countries. She has a book that I think it's amazing. It's called Millions Saved. And I think it's sort of an exemplar of how to translate evidence on public health interventions, among many other publications that she has led. Really, it's a pleasure to have you with us, Amanda, and thank you. I know you have a very active agenda now that you've rejoined the bank, working with the president. We also have in our panel Dr. Cynthia Loom. Also super thrilled to have Cynthia. I'm a big admirer of her work. She's a university professor of criminology, law and society at George Mason University and director of GMU Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy. She was named a fellow of the American Society of Criminology in 2021. She's a leading authority on evidence-based policing. Also a very long bio that I'm not going to read all, just to say that I think she has published one of the most impactful books on the topic of evidence-based policing, called Evidence-Based Policing: Translating Research into Practice. In addition, she has developed numerous tools and strategies to translate and institutionalize research into everyday law enforcement operations, including the evidence-based policing matrix, which has been one of the inspirations for us at the IDB when we designed the platform for Latin America and the Caribbean. In addition to all of this, and I think maybe one of the secrets of why it's so interesting, the work that Cynthia does, is that she's a former police officer and detective, and so she knows really not the research, but also the practice of policing. And finally, we have also an incredible and fabulous representative from Latin America, particularly from Brazil, Joana Monteiro, also a colleague, and I would say sort of one of the really people that is doing some of the most fascinating work in Latin America in evidence-based policing and criminal justice and violence prevention. She's the director of the Center for Applied Research to Public Security at Fundação Getúlio Vargas, where she's also a professor. She's doing very cutting-edge research on body-worn cameras, also on hotspot policing. We're doing together the first RCT on hotspot policing in Brazil. And on youth violence prevention and many other topics. And I think, like Cynthia, also part of the secret is that she's not only a leading research and academic, but also a practitioner. She worked as a head of research at the Rio de Janeiro State's Attorney's Office. And before that, that's for 3 years. And before that, as the head of the Institute of Public Security in the Secretary of Security from the state of Rio de Janeiro. And at both positions, Joana led initiatives to improve the use of evidence by public security and criminal justice agencies, and has implemented many projects to facilitate data analytics and to improve transparency to citizens. So with that introduction, let's start. Basically, the dynamic is going to be, let me stop sharing, like this. What we're going to talk about three topics, so three questions that we have. Basically, how to improve the quantity and quality of the research that we produce in terms of on policing and on justice and criminal justice and public safety. How to translate that research in a digestible form, in a way that is easy to understand and to use by practitioners. And the third question is how to incentivize the demand for research evidence from police agencies, from prosecutors, corrections, city and state governments. So those are the three big questions that we're going to be talking about. And basically, we'll start with the first one, and we'll go in order, having the perspective from the panel. I'll then summarize or say a little bit on what we are doing in the Citizen Security and Justice team, how we are approaching this topic briefly, and then we move to the second topic, second question. So let's start with the first one. And what on the research, or how can we stimulate the supply of research evidence? And the motivation for us, it's pretty obvious. We have in our platform, we have in our repository of evidence, there are 700, more or less, a bit more than 700 programs that have rigorous impact evaluations, experimental or quasi-experimental, that have passed certain thresholds of methodological quality. And out of those more than 700, only about 60 are from Latin America and the Caribbean. So that's less than 8%. So we need to increase that percentage. We need to know much more about what works and what doesn't in our countries, in our region, in our context, which are also very heterogeneous. But we need to stimulate the production of that research. So the question is particularly impact evaluations. Even though there are many types of research evidence and all of them are very useful and serve different purposes, now we are really in this discussion in the platform, we started with one type of research evidence, which is the one on effectiveness, knowing if the programs that we are funding, that we're supporting, do they have the intended effect? What type of effects do they have? So that's how to stimulate that kind of research that is relevant, that is high quality, and that is timely for decision makers. So I'll leave it at that, and I will start asking Cynthia if she can share with us a little bit of the American experience in criminal justice and policing, in terms of what can we learn in Latin America and the Caribbean from the US experience in terms of how to stimulate the supply of impact evaluations.
Sure. Thank you, Rodrigo and the IDB for inviting me here today and for bringing me onto this distinguished panel. I really appreciate it. I'm going to say some things that are probably obvious to the audience, but I want to give some detail that I think sometimes is overlooked. And that detail points to mistakes, I think, that the US and the UK made in the process of trying to build an evidence-based crime policy strategy from a national to a local level. The first thing is so important. I mean, having funding for research is that's a given. We often do not have enough social science funding for political science, economics, criminological funding, public policy funding to do research. And I want to say specifically, it doesn't have to come only from government. It can come from NGOs, agencies themselves. This is one thing that the US is still not very good at, but I think we're trying to make strides with. Having local agencies actually fund research in their own agencies. This is the core of the philosophy, the idea of evidence-based policing that Larry Sherman once talked about in his piece. The ideal, having agencies really invest in their own research. Let me say something about impact evaluations, because I think this is also a detail that is overlooked. Outcome evaluations are incredibly important, but outcome evaluations are part and parcel of something larger, which is program evaluation. And program evaluation encompasses a wide variety of different types of research methodologies. And the reason why I want to emphasize this is sometimes we can figure out, what works and what doesn't work, but why? What's the reason? Why did it fail? What was it about the agency that helped make this successful or that impeded that? How did community respond to the actual outcome? The outcome could be great from a perspective of crime reduction, but it could also cause harms. There are consequences to using different types of technologies or strategies. So funding is important, but guidance and strategy around that funding across from the local to the national, as well as a broader understanding of what is involved in this term evaluation is really key. The second thing I want to mention is partnership building. I think one thing that we really tried in the US that I think helped with developing an evidence-based crime policy strategy, at least at the national level, was encouraging partnership building and funding it. The Bureau of Justice Assistance of the US Department of Justice funds something called Smart Policing. Some of you may have heard of this initiative, and it really is about funding projects between researchers and practitioners. But I want to, again, add an important detail, I think, that is a lesson learned. One-up or ad hoc relationships are great, but what you're seeking is long-term relationships between research groups and agencies. How do you build those types of partnerships for years, right? And those are the ones that take you through when you don't have funding, when you're trying to figure out smaller answers around implementation, for example, of different interventions. So finding ways that local universities or local research groups can then partner with nearby agencies is so key. And I say local just because sometimes we don't have money to travel and to, and so the local experiences are really key. A lot of those researchers are from those areas and they'll know a lot more about those places. And finally, I just want to mention about researchers. I think one thing that really spurred the evidence-based crime policy movement in the United States was an attempt to have synergistic activities amongst researchers and trying to build their capacity for doing this type of work. Program evaluation, impact evaluations are very specific types of research that require a lot of different types of skills that are often not taught in the university setting. Most of the people probably around this table just picked it up from like their own experiences and trial and error. But I think we need to do a better job of that. These synergistic activities like Campbell collaboration, for example, that created systematic reviews around research, that created conferences around these research repositories, that created symposia, like our center does a lot of symposia and collaborations that try to build these synergistic activities amongst researchers and also practitioners. And I think those things, there's so many more, but those are the first things, Rodrigo, that come to my mind when we talk about how to increase supply. The devil is in the details. We all need funding, we all need knowledge, but like, how do you actually incentivize that at the local level?
Can you, that's excellent, Cynthia, super interesting. Just before we pass, can you tell us a little bit about smart policing? So you think that that is an example of the type of initiative that a federal government, in this case, the Department of Justice, can promote to incentivize?
Yes, governments tend to promote the supply of research from like funding a research project, right? They're not as savvy in funding partnerships to create evaluations, for example. They might assume that when you fund a research project, there's some kind of evaluation and partnership that's happening. That's a big assumption, right? So because researchers, sometimes we can do research on our own without involving anybody, right? So looking at data or something like this. So the smart policing is an attempt to build a community around what works and what doesn't in partnerships, not necessarily in the interventions themselves. And for me to be able to talk to somebody else about, hey, how did you do this in terms of working with this agency? What worked for you, right? I think that's really helpful So, funding both that supply and the demand infrastructure is really important.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Joanna, give us a little bit of the reality of how, what you see in terms of the challenges and opportunities in particular, and what to do with the supply of research in Brazil, in Latin America. What's your perspective on that?
Hi all, and hi Rodrigo. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's a great pleasure. So first thing I would like to say is that we really need to replicate research for Latin America. People are super skeptical about learning from evidence from US and UK. Using the academic term that we usually take, like they don't believe on the external validity of any research that is done to the United States. So we really need to have, I already have like the experience about telling about research findings from several papers in the United States, and people simply say, okay, but I don't believe that. Like Latin America is a completely different place, so we need research done by here. And the crucial difficult to do that is that people, because people are super skeptical, they don't even learn and don't even read about what have been done in the United States and UK and developed world in the last 30 years. So they simply do not know the kind of research that has been produced. There is a research that is super instrumental to learn how to improve practice. And it's also a research that is super intensive in data, which is one of the key challenges we have in Brazil. So typically when we discuss research in Brazil in the media and with practitioners, what they recognize as research is a very simple descriptive analysis that does not even provide a good diagnostic about what they are facing. So they in some sense, they have a reason to be skeptical about research findings, because I would say that few people were able to provide them with good research that can be useful for their activities. The key things so once in a while, when you have someone demanding for something, it's much more because they really believe that something is working, and they want to an outsider to tell the world that what they are doing is right, not because they want to learn with that. So what I think is the key challenge is how we can move on that. So the first thing is that the top academic, Brazil does have good academics. Most of them, a lot of them are not living in Brazil anymore, but like they are abroad, they can do research on Brazil. And we do have a lot of people here too, but we don't have incentives at all to do that. First, because the time that demands to build a partnership that, as Cynthia was telling, and having a result that is publishable to academic standards takes like something like 6, 7, 8 years with a lot of risk on it. So typically, like you start to develop this partnership, turnover in the public sector is super high. So you basically like spend 1-2 years developing a partnership with someone, and this person disappears, like it's removed to another one, and you completely lose everything. So in practice, it's a super risky project. And on top of that, you're probably going to spend a lot of time trying to replicate an evidence of something that has been tested in the US, which in academic terms, there is very low returns about publishing that later. So it's something like that people who does because they want to promote some impact, but it's completely like nonsense in terms of academic work. So I think what we need to start doing is like reducing the costs about working in partnership with the government. And this I'm saying I'm gonna list now some things we can do in order to improve supply. So in order to improve the interest of researchers to do partnerships with governments. So, and then later I can comment on the other side. First of all, one of the key challenges in Brazil is access to data. So we are talking about having access to very fine-grained data in order to provide to produce good research. And so people typically are terrified when you talk about that. So we have a good example in Brazil right now. So the group from Universidade de Pernambuco has done an amazing work about like connecting lots of administrative data. And I think it's good, a very good example to show how can we learn completely different things from study crime in Latin America. But also when you publish your results, it seems it's the example that the results that we publish, it's not identified in any level. So there is no risk at all about like exposing anyone and about sharing data. The problem is that the process is super, like, it requires a lot of identified data. So people are super skeptical about doing that. So I think IDB and the federal government must do initiatives in order like to push the government, local government, state governments, like to share data, organize data, and promote data transparency in order to reduce the costs about working with that. Then the second part would be funding, as Cynthia said, not funding, but she said, I totally agree with her about funding partnerships. As I mentioned, it's a highly risk activity in terms of time use. So we really need to invest on that. And I would say there's a lot of money in Brazil to that, but it's not like funneled to that. So first of all, we have the national institutions that finance research, such as NPK and CAPS. They're not funding at all this type of stuff. State governments spend like billions of reais in materials for public security. If you put like 0.5% of their budget related to invest in research, would be an incredible amount of money. And the final thing I would say is that it's about how to speak about priority teams. And I think this is something that IDB may have a major role. Like, we can't let only the government says what is priority. It's very tricky here, because at the same time, we want them to say what's priority, but I'm gonna give you an example. Brazil has a major problem with police violence. So we won't have state level governments pushing for this agenda. It must come from someone else. By now, we do have a federal government that cares about this, but we're gonna need like international agencies pushing for some issues that are like worldwide, we know are super crucial, but internally people do not care about it. I gotta pause here.
Fantastic, Joanna. You gave us a lot of things to reflect on. I'm staying with one, but there are many of it, which is there is funding. It's just that it's not directed necessarily to what we or an important part of it is not directed to generating evidence about what works and what doesn't, and the type of research that Cynthia was saying on program evaluation and impact evaluation, and I think that's part of the challenge where we can play a facilitating role. Then let me pass it to Amanda. Amanda, you've worked in many different topics on social protection, public health, and many others on this issue of how to generate better quality and timely and relevant research. What lessons can you share with us from your experience?
Well, thank you. And thank you to the other panelists. It's really a privilege to be here with you today. So first, I just want to say something about the Inter-American Development Bank Group. You know, we have two mandates. One is to provide financing for development, but the other is to generate knowledge. And the reason knowledge is part of our core mandate is because our lending is a small fraction of the total public spending on crime and security response or citizen security, or as a share, obviously, of private spending, the way households spend on this area, et cetera. So we're a drop in the bucket. So it's about the know-how and getting innovations that work scaled up and more into the mainstream. And I think that's why it's so important what the work of our citizen security team to put together the evidence platform and to work very propositively with government counterparts and academic groups to try and generate a body of evidence that we can act on to improve outcomes. So that's the first thing. But in my previous life, I just finished working on actually a big working group on how we can get evidence more fit for purpose for policy impact, with a lot of different people from lots of different sectors. And of course, the one thing I have to say is, although Rodrigo asked us to be quite disciplined and separated the question on supply of evidence from the question of demand for evidence, they're jointly determined. So that is sort of something that we have to cope with. And I guess, you know, the main way to stimulate supply is, of course, to have demand for that product. And I wanted to say a couple things about that. So first to say there's kind of a problem with the way that we generate evidence now in lots of sectors. First is that we can be very distant from the policy decisions of the day. And we might not respond to priorities and timelines and the questions that policymakers are grappling with. Second, often policymakers are lacking institutional incentives or funding to generate and act on evidence that's collected. And then sometimes the way we fund research can contribute to those disconnects between policy needs and the kinds of work that we're doing. I think I do take Joanna's very important point, which is that we should not only work on what policymakers want today, but what they're going to want tomorrow, because they're going to have a problem and they are going to need to defend themselves. But I think when we looked at sort of what was done on the supply side to deal with some of those problems that have been persistent in lots of fields for a long time, I would say a couple just to point out. So one, you, Cynthia, mentioned the importance of local agencies funding evidence themselves. And I would say also that the federal government can create very interesting incentives for the generation and use of evidence, especially in federal countries. So, I mean, in the United States, we have this Evidence-Based Policy Act, which means every single government agency has to have an agenda for evidence, has to have a chief evidence officer, needs to do, identify areas where they need outcomes-based evaluation or also different kinds of evidence to act. So I think that's an interesting point. And I think, the issue, Joanna, that you raised about the rate of return to this kind of evidence generation and use is huge. Of course, it only matters if we use it, not if we produce it and it's not used. So that's something that we're looking at, how is it that the evidence that we generate is saving money or time or enhancing the impact on the outcomes that we care about. I think the other sort of supply side approach that's been really interesting around the world is around embedded partnerships in agencies and ministries. And there are lots of different examples from India that just had a big tax reform, and they decided to use their huge tax, income tax database to assess what happens when we change certain dimensions of enforcement, what happens when we change other kinds of regulations, and sort of that learning as you go using administrative data is super interesting. And then you can have sort of regular updates. There are other issues with embedded partnerships, like the lack of independence that the evaluators might have because you're working for the man or the woman. So I think that's something else to think about, but it's an interesting model. I think the other piece is to take advantage of moments of reform and controversy. And, I think the classic example and really where impact evaluations or RCTs took off in development economics was around conditional cash transfers, because it was controversial to replace an in-kind food subsidy, in the case of Mexico, a tortilla, with cash. And so taking advantage of that controversy, we said, okay, we can use evidence to deal with these difficult political issues and to provide the politicians with the blindaje, the protection of evidence to implement controversial things. And I mean, there are other examples like that, like there was a major health reform in Colombia in the mid-90s where they were really switching systems very dramatically. And they said, okay, we're doing this, but we're going to monitor harms. We're going to make sure we are tracking all the things that people care about with this reform and whether it goes well or poorly. I think the other supply side intervention that can be really interesting and generate very virtuous incentives for peer pressure and accountability is around multi-country consortia. You mentioned smart policing, which I think is a great example, but there are other ones, like there was sort of water and sanitation. Suppose we know that based on small scale studies, certain kinds of interventions for water and sanitation work to improve the use of, to extend sewage or whatever it might be. So what the World Bank did with philanthropic funding was to sort of pilot the same approach adapted to context, but in 5 different settings, but using evaluation designs and questionnaires that would allow for comparisons across sites. And that can be good because you create this very virtuous community of researchers working on it. You give some space to the policymakers to say, oh, this is a regional initiative. It's not just me. And it keeps, it enables you to develop, kind of media outreach and things around your results as you go, which can also be virtuous. I have so many other things I would like to say, but I will be quiet until the next question. So thank you.
Wonderful, Amanda, fantastic, super rich, and with lots of suggestions. But yeah, we are, I think we'll probably will run out of time because there's, so for me, I mean, just to say a few things of what we're doing in the citizen security team in LAC, I think we see it as one of the big opportunities to help, picking up on what Joanna was saying about the usual way in which the funding from the science and technology policy is allocated in each country in Latin America. We see that there's always funding. All countries have a system to fund their science, and that includes also security. But generally, there is very the topics. The government has no influence in making them really useful for decision making. So the quality and it's very heterogeneous, and I think that what we've tried to do in some countries is to help government put together call for proposals. For instance, in Uruguay, we have through one of our loans, we work with the Ministry of Interior, which is the Ministry of Security, and the ANI, the National Innovations and Research Agency. We did supported a partnership between both the Ministry of Interior and the Innovation Research Agency, that they will put, the ANI will always have calls for proposals. And so in this case, they work together on a call for proposals on citizen security and justice that would take into account what is it that the Ministry of Interior wanted to learn, what type of knowledge they needed to improve their policies. And then, but it was all done through the traditional mechanisms of the science, funding for any sector. But really brought together these two agencies that before were not related at all. And we fund, the project funded more than 15 research projects, which went from ethnographies to quasi-experimental and experimental evaluations, a range of topics. And we think that there's an opportunity. We also, now with the Ministry of Public Safety and Justice in Brazil, we're designing a new loan, and part of one of the proposals that the government has made that we're supporting very actively is to create a type of NIJ, National Institute of Justice, which is called Institute of Research on Public Safety in Brazil. that basically will do both training for police and other practitioners and research. So have both arms, and I think it will be the first in Latin America and the Caribbean that I know. There is not, we don't have an NIJ in our countries, and so in some countries you see a lot of interest. Maybe the police, for instance, the Colombian police has a new in a set of reforms on policing that includes creating agencies that bring together to fund research decided together jointly by the police and a set of consortia of universities and the science and technology also policy in Colombia. So there are cases, I think, where interesting things are happening in terms of sort of institutionalizing or creating instruments like, I mean, what Amanda was saying would be fantastic to have the Evidence-Based Policy Act from the US. Of course, it's a major, it's a game changer in terms of demanding agencies to at least to start preparing themselves to start to produce and reflect on how they're going to learn, what they want to learn, having people in place. So if we could do that, I think that would be ideal. But we have sort of through our loans, we'll try to support this type of reforms. And then of course we do our own research jointly or through calls for proposals also. And also we work on the data part, which as Joanna was saying is critical, trying that in all our loans we help to improve the quality of the data, the administrative data, victimization surveys in partnership with UNODC and other partners. We also promote the generation of new evidence, of new data. But I want to move to the second, and maybe we'll bring together the next two into one. So, I wanted to talk about also then the translation of evidence. Our platform is an example of that. Is okay, for us the challenge was, we have all this evidence, how do we break what Joanna was saying, which is this skepticism, which I agree there is a skepticism, but also there is something more basic, which is lack of access. I mean, the access, it's all in English, so people sometimes react skeptically because they have a hard time even sort of reading the most basic sort of information about what has been produced in the North, to say. So what we try to lower that barrier by having these summaries in Spanish and Portuguese. And actually have to say that we're having a fantastic sort of feedback in terms of, people are very excited and are using it. And so we want to do more. We want to sort of take advantage of this platform that we're creating, that we have created, and and use it more. So I would love to hear from you on translation of evidence. What else can we do? Of course, Cynthia, you've done a lot on that front. Amanda, also your book and many other things that you've done. And Joanna, I know that you also been thinking a lot about this and you've done this in practice. So that something on translation, and the final one was on the demand for research evidence.
Yeah.
And yeah, so feel free to, we have like 15 more minutes. So, it can take 5 minutes to comment on what you think the main messages you would like to share.
Well, Rodrigo, I'd like to dovetail off of Amanda's move towards the institutionalization and the demand side, because that's very much connected with translation. And I know there are folks on this call listening in that are practitioners. You're working inside of agencies. A lot of what we're talking about is at the policy level, is at the federal level, is at the funding level. But ultimately, and this is the case in the United States to this day, we still struggle with, and we have a lot of infrastructure at those higher levels and at the leadership levels in agencies, but we're still struggling with the basic unit of criminal justice, which is the practitioner and implementation, right? And so I just wanted to give a couple of comments, both that relate to translation and demand for the practitioners that are listening in this room, especially those who are leading practitioner groups like courts or corrections or policing. I would ask all of you to take a hard look, and this will force you in some ways to reflect on the evidence, but to take a hard look at the systems that are in place in your agencies. Ultimately, we can incentivize leaders, we can incentivize policymakers, but winning the hearts and minds of those actually implementing evidence-based approaches is more than carrots and sticks. I really believe that incentivizing requires changing systems. Humans will operate in whatever system that they are given. So, as a patrol officer, they threw me into a patrol car and I go patrolling in the streets. I'm working within the deployment system that I'm given, right? Within the accountability system that I'm given. So I would say to the practitioners in the room, take a look at your accountability systems. That is where the translation of the evidence occurs, okay? So most of the time, criminal justice systems have very weak accountability infrastructure. You have low first-line supervision, low supervision generally, with high levels of discretion at the operational level. There's often a lack of performance and recording of what people are doing, and that goes into what Joanna is talking about with a lack of data too. Data is an element of performance metrics, right? And so thinking about one system, which is the accountability system, and how you might get first-line supervisors to first know the knowledge and then actually implement it within their squads or within their prosecution teams. How do you ensure the appropriate use of risk assessment, for example, in courts and correctional agencies? Or within domestic violence assessments, right? You actually need to know that there's a risk assessment tool out there and that how it can be applied and in what ways it can be useful. And accountability system supervision, especially first-line supervisors, are key translators, but yet most of the time, including in the US, they have no clue of anything that we're talking about here. The knowledge or the action. Deployment systems. So my area of expertise is in policing, but this can apply to prosecutors or to the courts, right? Think about your deployment system. I literally mean like what the officers are doing when they go out on a day-to-day basis. In the US, we have a very reactive case-by-case deployment system for both police and prosecutors, for the courts as well, okay? Evidence-based approaches say, no, that doesn't necessarily lead to good outcomes. You need a more proactive deployment system. You need a more problem-solving deployment system. You need a more place-based, not just individual-based deployment system, right? If you have not assessed your deployment system, if you do not know what your deployment system is, then how do you know what to change from, right? So I would encourage everybody who's a practitioner in this room to say, okay, where are we, right? What is our deployment and how aligned is that with some basic elements of what we know from the evidence in terms of what is effective. And some of this can come from Latin American evidence. It does not have to come from US evidence, because basically the evidence is saying the same, similar things. Part of that deployment is with training systems as well. And so this is a huge challenge in the United States. Our academies do not teach evidence-based policing. Like, what do we know about operations that are effective in reducing and preventing crime? This is not being taught in our academies. So we're also in the exact same boat as all of you are, right? In that at that basic operational level of training and then implementation of training in the field, that connection is just simply not there. Trainers are translators, and they're key translators because researchers, we're not in the academy. We can't do that type of training. So I would encourage all of you to take especially the practitioners, to take a look at some of those systems. There's many other systems, managerial systems, IT system, data system, but these systems inside of your agency that build the infrastructure of the organization, that needs to be re-engineered in order to accommodate for what the evidence is saying in criminal justice. Everything that officers think they knew about what was going to work to reduce crime doesn't. So how do you undo that and build in new infrastructure? And that's ultimately how you naturally incentivize. You want cops to think, oh, that's policing, even though just naturally, right? As opposed to, why am I doing this? Somebody told me to do this, right? Sorry, Rodrigo. I'm sorry.
No, that's fabulous, Cynthia. And I know you've written a lot about this. So in your books and a lot of your material, there's a lot more meat on how to think about this. But you've given me an idea for our platform already. So that I think that we should, because I agree with you. I mean, part of the challenge is in also in helping, in giving tools to practitioners on how to apply the evidence that we know. And as you say, one approach is to take the different systems, like the institutional systems of an organization, and ask that question. But then you need also, to help them saying how, for instance, how you change the deployment of your patrolling. And with Joanna, we've been working in one state in Brazil precisely on that with the RCT and hotspot policing. And it was very instructive. So I think what we can do, we have in the platform a section on training resources and for training. I think we could have something. I like your idea of the systems, thinking about, accountability, deployment, data, and maybe do a series on, okay, guides, what type of guides. And I think that there are available some guides from the College of Policing of the UK or here in the US that does that, that is directly aimed at the practitioner to help them reflect, do the kind of exercise that you are proposing, and that you've done also in George Mason University. And I mean, there are a few that, again, they're most all in English. So we could pick and maybe start a series on tools for mainstreaming evidence in the institution through, this type of diagnostic process. And so I think that would be super, super interesting. Let me move then to Joanna. Joanna, what would you like to share from your experience on this topic?
Yeah, well, I would like to reinforce Cynthia's point on the police academies. I think we need to, one of the key points is that most of policemen and practitioners are trained in their own academies, which very few contact with the universities. So I think one of the crucial thing about talking about how to use more evidence in their practice is to promoting more training on this within the police academies. And we would start to discuss that. For you to have an idea, in Brazil, I would say that typically you have one course of criminal analysis if you have some during your whole 3 years training. So I think IDB can push a lot on that. And also in that point, as you were saying, Rodrigo, really producing content for the ones who want to become, who wants to start training about that. Because another issue is that we don't have materials in Portuguese. And I think the platform you have created is super important, but it's also super hard in terms of you kind of already know, have been exposed to that, have been convinced about the willing, and have some willing to use evidence, but we need material to explain each research, what have been done, and to explain what the culture, the idea, the framework about use of evidence in public policies. And in that sense, I would like to give the example about when we did the impact assessment about body-worn cameras in São Paulo, Brazil. We produced a technical report in Portuguese that doesn't have any value in academic terms, but it's what the material that a practitioner can read and understand the methodology behind the research. And this is the typical, I would call this a technical report for non-experts that is super crucial, to translate research, and nobody's producing that. This is kind of I see some institutions provide policy briefs, but sometimes the policy briefs is super small and it's for a broader audience. I am saying about technical reports, but for in Portuguese or in Spanish, for practitioners to understand the mechanics, what the research has been done. Another thing that I want to emphasize is that we need, I really like a paper from the founder of 3IE that it calls the need for knowledge brokering institutions. The idea that you have to be someone's job to do the bridge between researchers and practitioners. And I would say that I would stimulate for any practitioners here that are listeners, that each police level unit, each prosecutor's level should have a unit, evidence-based unit. I run a type of unit like that in the state attorney's office in Rio de Janeiro, but because you need someone that has some academic training doing the translation about what the researchers are doing and what the prosecutors were doing. But on the other hand, so I would say that each public institution should have one. We are talking about a very small office, 5 people can do this job. They're doing really intermediation, a lot of the job will be done by practitioners, but you need someone to do the bridge. And on the other hand, you also need a type of institution within the research area, within the universities, which is, I believe, is the kind of center that Cynthia runs, and you have several examples in the United States, but non-example in Latin America that I'm aware of, that is really researchers that are willing to work with practitioners and building this partnership. For someone who is in the government, who is a practitioner, who knows that he's doing something that he wants or he or she wants to improve, they have someone they can look for and ask them, can you help me to think about this project? For instance, in the project we have in Paraná, they have already approached us and told us, look, we are doing this work in order to reduce violence against women, but we know it's not really effective. Can you help us to think deeply about that and think about how to improve that? This is a 5-year work. And if you start doing and if you say that in advance, people say, no, I don't have political window in order to work that. But on the other hand, on the top jobs in the government, you don't have people people work with really tiny windows about how much time they have, but you have intermediate levels. There are people who are there and they're going to stay there for 5 years, 10 years term. And this is the challenge. I would say the key challenge is how to reach these people and creating partnerships with them. So I'm going to pause here because we are running out of time, but I just want to point out that another opportunity, I really think that the hotspot policing program that we are doing in Brazil, IDB is pushing it. It's really an example of what are the projects we should pursue in order to create examples of partnerships between researchers and practitioners, and to show people, to be showcases about this is what the type of thing we can learn. This is how we work together. And once you have that, you're going to have the practitioners who are working with us should be the ones who, I hope, in the future, we're going to be pushing this agenda and telling the others and his friends and his coworkers, say, let's do more of that. We can do that. This type of work can be done in Latin America. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanna. Excellent insights. We're running a bit out of time, but Amanda, you can take 5 minutes. I would love to hear what you think about this.
I'll take less. I think first, I really endorse Cynthia's idea of, taking advantage of opportunities to mainstream evidence in systems as they operate, whether it's the police or the courts or the penitentiary system, as well as the need for sort of knowledge brokering. And what I say is that evidence needs advocacy on its own, which means just using every possible tool available to raise the visibility of the work and its impact, and that it's an issue that matters for effectiveness, but also just that there's a constituency for evidence that's out there that's asking for this information and holding public agencies accountable in that sense, including parliaments, Congress, et cetera. I just want to say a few words about Millions Saved. This was a book of case studies that I put together in my past work, but I offer it because I can imagine you doing a similar thing like Millions Safe. And I think what's helpful, it's a layperson's kind of book, but it's sort of detailed case studies. We selected them based on, they were solving an important problem in the health sector. They were large scale. They were cost effective with an attributable impact. But also we included aspects of the leadership. Who is the leader who implemented this innovation? How much budget did it take? What were the problems that they encountered? We made it more human. And that really was so effective at getting the word out, because it was, too often as people who evaluate, you read a study and you own that intervention in the public domain. No, it should be the person, make a hero out of reformers in our systems and place them there with the evidence. And I think that those kinds of example setting can be really, really powerful. But just thanks to great co-panelists and to you, Rodrigo, for putting together the panel.
Thank you, Amanda. I really loved the book Millions Saved, and I love that example on the latrines in Indonesia. But the way that the different aspects, the way you told the story, all the political economy, is not only the evidence, but what happened with the study, the difficulties in generating it, but also how it was used, and the life beyond the study. So I think it's fantastic, and it's a website. So I think anybody that types Millions Saved will find it on the internet. It's very well done from a communications perspective. So very easy to read and really interesting. Yeah, that would be fabulous to have a Millions Saved also example. So yeah, thank you, Amanda. So I know you're super busy and I don't want to take more of your time. I would keep talking for hours because this is something that's really important for us and for the region. But I think we've learned in 1 hour, we've learned a lot. We'll also continue using what we discussed here to share, to build this constituency. As Amanda was saying, there is a constituency out there that we're trying to build and develop and strengthen. That's a big part of the role of the platform, is also to, as Joanna was saying, is the process of helping those people emerge and connect to each other, and finding those middle managers that we all the time find very passionate about this in police, in courts, in prosecutions, in corrections, in local governments and federal government. So I think that's, we are thinking on how to create this, not create, but strengthen this community of practice in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think we got a lot of ideas today. I really appreciate it. And
don't give up.
Yeah.
Don't give up. It's a hard this is very hard, but it's important and it's rewarding, and don't give up, especially for I'll say this to the university researchers in the room.
Thank you. No, I think we are very passionate in Latin America and the Caribbean. And once you were bitten by the bug of evidence and effectiveness and using science to improve lives, I think then you're hooked for life. So we see that level of energy in the region, and we'll do our best to support it. And thank you, Cynthia, Joanna, Amanda, for your time and your sharing your wisdom. And we'll be in touch. And I think I have to make one more, let me, before I forget, sharing. We've done these digital badges since we did a series of 7 webinars for the people that can let me see if is it being shown, the digital badge, this, so people can have this recognized as part of their training. We did this with IDB Academy, and so there you can get your digital badge. And with that, thank you to everybody once again. Bye-bye.